where were you born? Tell me about the family you were born into. Tell me about your mother
Wow.
and father.
My mother and father, uh, I think it was a prearranged marriage. My mother being an orphan at the time, living with this Greek family that had adopted her, and one of the members of the family was my father, who was a seaman, and he traveled around the world out of Istanbul or Constantinople, the Greeks would always say. And I think when he returned after a particular voyage, he married my mother. I think she was about 16 at the time. And they went on their honeymoon to Volos, and uh, and then he arranged for her to come to America, where he had established residence and citizenship. And she apparently became pregnant during the honeymoon, and so she gave birth soon after arriving. At the time, my father had a sister living in New York City, in Brooklyn, I guess, and they lived close to one another. I guess my father found an apartment near them, so they lived close to one another, and so she felt comfortable, I guess, to a certain extent. So I think they moved around at different apartments. I
Well, let's
understand.
talk about
Okay.
them a little bit more. So
Okay.
your
All
your
right.
father was
So
he
he
was
came.
born. So how old was he? I mean, how much older was he than your mother? And
Uh,
so when she was adopted by the family, but he really didn't know her much. He wasn't around much.
no, I don't think so. Yeah, I think that was the case. So I think it's difficult to say. I'm not sure how much older, but he had to be about 20 years older than she was. That's my guess. Something in that range. It may have been 15, it may have been 25, I'm not sure. And so they lived near, and I guess for whatever reason they moved to Douglas Street, where I was born in Brooklyn. I think they were living at Fifth Avenue at the time. Maybe they needed a larger apartment. And my father, for a while, this was during the 1926 when I was born, so I expect it wasn't easy for my father to find employment because his English was somewhat limited, and of course my mother didn't speak any English at all. And my father worked for a time for his brother-in-law, who was my aunt's husband, and they were childless. And according to my mother, they offered to adopt me since they were childless. They had been married for many more years before my parents were married. And so that apparently set up some ill feeling between my mother and her sister-in-law. And that resentment carried through for many years until I was about 18. So there was an alienation between those two families. Later, as I grew up, I began to doubt whether that had been the case. But as I grew older, I began to doubt many things that my mother told me. I think my mother was a rather insecure person and very asocial, and had a tendency to lie or create different stories. So I can never be sure what she ever told me was truth or mythology or something
What did
she
she tell
dreamed.
you about her youth, about her childhood, and
Well, she told me she'd lived with this family, and I think it was a pleasant relationship as far as I knew. But the fact that her mother died giving birth to her left her as an orphan, since her father was a seagoing man himself. And so she was raised by her father's sister, who was a teenage aunt at the time. So my mother was raised by a teenager that I assumed with limited education. And consequently, many of the things my mother grew up believing was handed down from her aunt at the time. So a lot of these stories were difficult to believe later as I grew up. So
so so what was this? So your father had been at sea for quite a while,
yeah, and then he began to.
and I guess he just wanted to immigrate to America. He was tired of it. What it was just the
I think
time.
it was the economic situation. I think the the Greeks after the 20s weren't particularly welcome in Constantinople, and there was a mass immigration in the about 1920, 21, and I think that was one of the reasons. I think he had established residency in America since he had landed, I think, in Baltimore and established residence there. I'd come across his Siemens papers attesting to that on his death. So he, it was difficult for him to find employment at the time, and I think he worked for his brother-in-law, and that may have added to the difficulties in their relationship. I remember as a child, he had worked as a painter, probably working for his brother-in-law, and fell off a scaffold and received a rupture and was in the hospital for a week or more. And on his return, he had grown a mustache, and the story was that I asked my mother, "Who's that man?" You know, I had forgotten what he looked like. He didn't look like the father I remembered. And according to my mother, I was a pretty bright child, and there are all kinds of little stories that she perpetuated about how smart I was, and was able to take clocks apart and, with no pieces left over or something. So at the time, her only contact was her aunt in Greece. And so I remember as a child, her aunt had married a chef on one of the Greek ships, and he would make periodical visits to America on the trips from Greece or Europe to America, and he would bring staples, or my grand aunt would send us care packages essentially, and you know, wheels of cassetti and olives and olive oil and that kind of thing. So I know somewhere along the line, her aunt's husband died at sea, and he was buried at sea. And being a chef, I think my mother inherited one of the Tselemenderi's cookbooks, which he was a classic Greek chef of his time, and it's been translated in English, but this was the original Greek cookbook that he worked from. It was a big volume. It was almost an atlas-sized book, I remember that. And so we lived in what were called cold water flats, where there was no central heating. At that time, the oil burners were the prevalent means of heating an apartment, and that meant kerosene being toted up and filled into an oil burner. Although some of the early apartments I remember that we lived in were coal-fired or wood-burning stoves with auxiliary hot water heaters running a coil into that hot box, into the firebox, rather than a separate gas heater. We did a lot of moving as I was growing up. What I remember were the Depression years. And at that time, the economy was such that a landlord would offer 1 month's free rent to anyone who would take an apartment. And as a result, I think we moved every month when the rent became due, or so it seemed to me for a while. So I moved around from public school to public school. But when I first entered public school, I spoke virtually no English. So it was that kind of an adjustment that I had to make. Greek was the only language spoken in our home. Of course, my parents also spoke Turkish when they didn't want me to understand anything that they said. And since they both spoke Turkish fluently, and that was their culture really, even though they were Greek nationals.
What do you think were some of the Turkish cultural beliefs? I don't want to say superstitions, but some of the things that you grew up with that you really do recognize as more Turkish than Greek.
Well, the music, even the so-called Greek music, was really a Turkish influence, except for the European influences of waltzes and certain love songs, Italian songs. But the Greek radio programs that we listened to were, I remember the Turkish influence more than I remember other songs. The cuisine, of course, was, when I look back now, I understand it was predominantly Turkish culture, the pastries, and I found out later that really the Greeks just inherited most of that cuisine as their own, because the native Greeks just had a little bit of lamb and vegetables, and that was pretty much their cuisine. There wasn't anything particularly exotic, as the Turkish eggplant dishes like imam baldi and tarama salata, and that kind of all Greek pastries that go are really Turkish pastries, and even the confections, like Turkish delight and things of that sort. Can't remember anything predominantly in Turkish culture other than that. It was the food and the music, and certainly didn't dress Turkish style. That wasn't clothing was not a thing. The furniture, I don't know what Turkish furniture is like, but in America it was American furniture.
Remember any of the superstitions?
Oh, she had a whole
that
series.
used to?
She believed that mayonnaise was poisonous. Right? So therefore, we never had mayonnaise in the house. It was. She remembered a young girl in her youth who had died as a result of eating mayonnaise. Now it's possible the mayonnaise was contaminated, and she got something, but that's what they attributed to as best she remembered. I'm not so sure she remembered everything correctly, but so she had a classic story for that. I don't know whether, well, she grew up with certain superstitions that she got from that period, and there were quite a few. I can't recall too many of them. Perhaps one will come to mind. But it was, we had certain things we grew up with, and certain tastes and approaches. Oh, you things like you shouldn't drink milk after eating fish. You shouldn't go, the classic myths of not going into the water. Of course, we did no swimming. Our exposure was going to Coney Island and just wading, really, holding onto the ropes that they had and splashing around. So I never really learned to swim. I didn't learn to swim really till I was in my mid-20s. Swimming was a requirement in my high school for graduation. It was a unique high school I went to, and had a tremendous Olympic-sized pool, and I had to take swimming lessons. But at one point I almost drowned, where one of the students virtually pulled me out because saw me gagging, but I went sailing in my mid-20s with a friend, and I had taken Malamo, my wife, along. We were invited. We were courting at the time, or I was courting, and we went on sailing trips. And he would drop anchor near the shore, since he had a sloop and couldn't go in too far, and that meant my having to swim toward the shore because we had breakfast on the beach. And my wife was surprised that I jumped in and floundered and made it to the shore, but she realized that she could have lost her fiancé right then and there. I mean, I didn't feel afraid, but by that time I was able to dog paddle and get to the beach. So based on that, I started to do more and more swimming.
What do you remember? Do you have your first child? Do you know what your first childhood memory is? Can you remember that?
As a
Or
childhood?
very, very young memories. What sort of memories do you have?
Oh, I don't know. I may have been about 3 or 4 when I would remember particularly my grandaunt's husband visiting, because we didn't have too many visitors. We lived in, I say, these cold water flats or apartments in Brooklyn, and but we would go visiting. My father was a pretty social kind of fellow, and I think I don't remember when my brother was born, since he was about 4 years younger than I was, so I don't really remember any of that. I remember him as a baby in the household at some point, but I remember being brought to kindergarten when I was about 5, and I remember my mother dropping me off, and I don't know, and probably picking me up regularly. I think was probably about a 2-block walk from our home at the time to the school, and I think we probably stayed in that school system till about 3rd grade, or close enough to that area so I could go to that school. But then we moved regularly from then on, and
So this moving all the time, it was you couldn't. Your father was having a hard time holding a job. How far would you move?
yeah.
What was that like? Would you maintain any contacts? Or did you
Well,
always
there
feel?
were even my mother was rather self-conscious socially, as I say, and even going to church wasn't a regular good affair. Uh, she may have felt self-conscious about the clothes she wore. I really don't know. Uh, but we would. I was baptized in St. Constantine in Brooklyn, although we didn't live near it. We would still go to that church. It meant walking. Rarely did we ever take a subway. And it was long walks. And I think my mother stayed rather healthy and thin most of her life. And she was a very attractive woman. And I think Jill reminds me much of her beauty. And but there were long walks. I remember she had met someone on the boat coming over, and she maintained contact with that family, and that family had a daughter about her age, so we would visit her often, as I remember, and it was a long walk. We're talking about possibly 2 subway station distances to get to, that's the terms I remember in terms of distance. I would add that up to probably 2 miles, with my mother pushing a baby carriage and pushing my brother along, and I strolling along with her to go to visit these friends that she had, and we'd spend a few hours, and then was a walk back again. So, and a funny incident there, this particular woman's father was a peddler, a hot dog peddler with a push cart, and I remember one time visiting the family. Now, at the end of this tour of duty with the push cart, he'd come home and park the hot dog wagon in the vestibule of the tenement that they lived in. It may have been only a 2-family house, and at the end of the day, he would bring up his sauerkraut and unsold hot dogs and then supplies back into the apartment. But at night, overnight, he would put the hot dogs in about 6 inches of water in the bathtub. So there's an image of my visiting, using the bathroom and being startled by these hundreds of hot dogs floating in about 6 inches. And that's an image that has stayed with me all my life. I don't know how old I was, possibly 5 or 6. So we had my father, as I say, being a social person, he was a pretty good drinker, and he would go to the taverns or the Greek Affinia at the time and maintain his contact with some friends, and some of those friends would come to the house. It was still traditional to have a name day celebration, and some friends would come. It's like open house. You don't invite your friends to come. They know it's your name day, and they'll make an effort to visit. And so we occasionally had visitors that sort. He had a close friend, a cousin, who was a drinking buddy. He had quite a few drinking buddies. and we would visit, whatever the occasion was. If it was their name day, then it was our turn to visit, and and uh, so I guess I must have been a pretty smart kid in grammar school, because by the time somewhere in the 8th grade, I my mother was invited to the school, and I wasn't aware that she was coming. And there was a end of term assembly meeting, and I can't remember what it was all about, but my mother was in the background with a few other parents, and I was called up to receive a scholarship medal, and I guess an American Legion History Medal, and of course my mother was proud, and I can't remember my feelings at the time other than surprise that I must have had pretty good grades to receive those medals.
Did you enjoy school?
I did. I think I was fortunate that the New York City school system that I was in was at its best at those years. Dedicated teachers, facilities were old. There wasn't anything special. I remember schools where the classrooms were divided by sliding doors, and they could slide the doors into 2 different directions, and all of a sudden 4 classrooms became one big auditorium, essentially. So the students in those 4 classrooms could be drawn into an assembly. I remember there was school lunches then, and what I remember was just peanut butter and jelly, and probably some bananas as fresh fruit. And I'm sure there was milk, I just don't remember that. But the only special things I remember, occasionally I guess there was tuna fish on a whole wheat bread. That's the images I seem to remember, the luncheons there. So, and of course we moved around a lot, so I didn't end up matriculating or graduating from the same school I had begun. I may have visited 2 or 3 cases. At one point, as I remember, my mother became very ill. There was much to do about something, and I wasn't aware. People came in to help. She was bedridden, the whole thing. Apparently, she had had an abortion. She had become pregnant, and I guess they felt they couldn't afford another child. And I don't know the circumstances, don't know any of the details, but I realized when she came home, she had had an abortion, and there was tremendous bleeding. That's all I remember, and all kinds of dressings and so on. And don't really know the circumstances, they not knowing what the right thing to do was at the time, and the mores being what they were. And so apparently she underwent an abortion that did not go well. And I guess she came close to death. Now I can't even remember whether it was before or after my sister was born. So I really don't, because of the economic situation, to have another child and what have you. So, but at any rate, my father had a cousin who was a bachelor, and they were very friendly. And in fact, he would take me. As a bachelor, I don't know where he lived, but somewhere in Brooklyn, I think. And he read detective stories. I remember that was a big thing. All the pulp fiction at the time. He also would go regularly to the Criterion Theater on Broadway, which at that time was strictly a newsreel theater. You'd see 2 hours of nothing but newsreel documentaries. And he took me along. And it's possible he even took my brother along. That goes back then. And I really enjoyed the films. I remember at the time films of the Nanking atrocities being filmed, or the Japanese in China. I remember the Civil War being a newsreel thing, and it wasn't just a few minutes as you see today, 30-second pop and the news item changes. These were good 15, 20 minutes, possibly half hour, sometimes maybe an hour film on current events. And I don't recall whether it was Movie Tone News or whoever it was, Pathé. But and that was I looked forward to that treat on a Saturday. He would when he wasn't working, I guess. But anyway, so he was a regular visitor to our home. He being the bachelor, my father would invite him home for dinner and that kind of thing. But apparently, he was attracted to my mother, and there may have been overtures that were rejected, or I really don't know anything. As a child, I wasn't aware of anything. But at one point, I was in public school, and my brother was in school too. He may have been in kindergarten at the time. And the teacher came to me and said, "Your mother's here to take you home." And I was surprised. I didn't know what was going on. And my mother was waiting for us down at the principal's office. She says, we're moving, she said, in the middle of the day. And she took us and we went to Manhattan. My father was working on Astor Place in one of the loft buildings as an elevator operator, I think, maybe a maintenance man there too, I don't recall. And so he was working in Astor Place, and we went to meet him at the end of the working hour. We waited for him, and he had arranged for, he found an apartment on 8th Street, St. Mark's Place. And suddenly we were moving that night into this apartment. What had happened was during the school day, while we were at school, this friend of the family had come and knocked on the door. My mother was alone with my daughter, my sister, who was a little bit more than an infant, but I don't know what transpired, but essentially my mother was frightened of him trying to enter into the house. So we were living in a tenement where it was a ground floor apartment, and she actually went out the back window and jumped to the backyard level, taking my sister in arms and running through the backyards, and called my father apparently at the time, and she came and took us out of school. And so there was a period there where she would be, my father came and pressed charges against a friend, and there were trials. There was a trial, and it was continuously being postponed, put on agenda. I don't recall the circumstances. Eventually, the trial was held, and he was acquitted. But as a result, to get away and let my mother feel secure, we went underground in a sense. We left Brooklyn for the first time, and lived for about 2 years, I guess, or so, in Manhattan on the Lower East Side. I guess till after the trial was over. And that was about 1939, because, or 38, because I befriended, my friend was a neighbor, and he was a young kid called Pinky. His family was from Czechoslovakia, so they were quite concerned about the invasion of Hitler into the Sudetenland and what transpired there. I recall. So I had to be about 13 is my guess. 38, I would have been 12.
So you went to school in Manhattan
I went to a junior high school, Henry P. O'Neill Junior High, which was probably about 9th or 10th Street near Avenue C or D. And that was a completely different culture. At lunch break, the peddlers were selling knishes and those lupini beans and chickpeas. I think, salt and pepper, I remember, and treats that were, uncommon to me up until that point. So.
Did you? I mean, how would you characterize the difference between Manhattan and Brooklyn through your eyes at that time?
Well, I didn't see. I think it was probably even more crowded in Manhattan where we lived. We were really living in tenements, maybe 4 or 5 story tenements where they were so old that there was a common toilet in the hallway for 2 or 4 apartments, and the bathtub was in the kitchen with a covered board that you lifted, and and took your baths that way. And we lived in a building that all those buildings were connected with some kind of an air shaft, open yard, very small open yard, and connecting one of them was a Romanian restaurant. So what I remember there were the burnt garlic odors that I was unfamiliar with, and a lot of odors that came up that were not familiar to me at the time, and remained in my mind as not particularly desirable odors to be smelling all the time. But being so densely populated and inhabited on that street, I got to meet quite a few playmates, if you would. And on our street was a cigar maker, sat in the windows rolling cigars, which was something to watch. Next door was a Russian bath. Then there was some other restaurants in that street connecting. There was always something to do to distract you just walking around the block. The sites were, there was a cheap barber school on the Bowery. We were on the same block as the Bowery. And there was Peter Cooper Union across the street. That was something to watch, to see. You know, it was something you could wander. You know, it was not. I don't remember a traffic problem. There being enough traffic lights, but you could walk and walk and walk and see the sights in New York City, as opposed to Brooklyn, where there wasn't that much of a variety of sights. You could take the subway for a nickel, travel all the way to the Bronx and back for that same nickel, travel miles and miles in the subway if you were so inclined. We would often take rides like that, just in the first car with the window open and just stand in front and get that. And just watch the stations appear as you approach them. So,
What I know you were poor, and the
yeah.
people who you were living with were poor, and all around you. Did you have a sense of New York City as there being another city there that was, kind of one of the central cities of the world? There was this high life. There was this other world.
No,
there.
I was not aware of that. I lived in my own preteen and teenage years, and then I think at the age of 13 we were already back into Brooklyn, where I spent the last year in the 8th grade in a particular school and graduated with honors there. And I was quite ignorant of much of the life that was ahead of me, certainly, or what was expected of me. I was surprised in that when I was approached by the teacher to say that, well, you haven't chosen your high school yet. And I didn't know what that meant even. Well, everybody else had chosen the high school by then, and I had entered in the middle of the term or something, and she handed me a booklet that was handed out to the 8th grade graduates to be, and where you selected the high school. Any high school in New York City was available to you. It wasn't a requirement to go to your neighborhood high school, and they wanted to know what course of study I wished to enter into, and I had no idea. With no guidance and no, my parents were not in a position to know what I was doing even, or what I was expected to do.
So how did you determine what school?
It was really a surprise. It was like, in a way, fortuitous, because that determined my life at the age of 13. I looked at the brochure, and there were fields of study like business and accounting and secretarial and mechanics and vocational and that kind of thing. And I saw the word chemistry. Now, I knew nothing about chemistry. I didn't know what the word even meant, but it sounded interesting. Maybe I'd read an article or something. So it looks like they've just arrived. And chemistry sounded appealing. I thought, well, I think I'd like to study chemistry. Well, I looked under chemistry, and there were only 2 high schools that were even referred to. One was Henry Stubenmuller's Textile High School. It was a high school, vocational high school, that taught sewing and cutting of fabrics and anything to do with the textile industry. And they offered one course on dyeing of fabrics, and that was the extent of their chemistry. But I came across the Brooklyn Technical High School, which had a whole raft of. They actually had a full curriculum of just. It was called the chemical course. Being a technical high school, it was unique, and they offered courses in architectural engineering, practically, or mechanical, or there was a college preparatory curriculum also where most of the smart kids had enrolled in that. But I enrolled for the chemistry thing. Well, that required taking a qualifying examination before you could enter that. So they had already selected in that grammar school, the people who had applied for taking that test. And I had to go to the principal's office and request that he add my name to that list. Well, the envelope had already been sealed. And so the principal opened the envelope and then had the secretary add my name to it. And out of the 7 or 8, I think I was the one of 2 that were accepted in that high school. And then I remember arriving for orientation, and I was with a fellow, and he says, "What course are you taking?" He said, I said, "Chemistry." And he said, "What do you know about chemistry?" And I said, "I didn't know anything." This was a smart kid whose cousin was in school also taking chemistry. They had their own laboratory. I mean, they were smart kids that knew everything about chemistry before I even knew what the word meant. But after 4 years, I received the chemistry medal. He was not even a contender. We want to cut this with the kids here?
Are they here?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.